These sharp objects might look like torture devices, which were carefully lined up and made for the hurting of somebody. If you thought that that's what they were, you could be correct in another part of the world. But in this part of the world, things like these are only manufactured for one purpose: healing. So, what part of the world are we talking about? Well, easy. The Middle East. In the Middle East, a bunch of doctors who had been looking around for information decided that one of the great, let's call it, sciences of medicine outside of potions and magic and oils and ointments and alcohol was surgery. They were not the first to utilize this, as we will eventually see based on other images. But you can see there syringes and all kinds of devices, some hooks that were used to peel back the eye in order to make a surgery on the eyes, removing cataracts. They looked deep into the body. They investigated it. They drew and wrote all the pieces of it, helping them fully understand what they were going against. In some cases, magic would fly out of the room because of sophistication. In others, it would return. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because you have to give people some kind of hope. Medicine was not limited only to human beings. In some cases, they treated animals. Of course, the majority of animals that they treated were tame animals, and so it was to the benefit of humans anyway. But in other cases, there were people who were studying animals outside of the tame ones, namely people like Al-Jahiz, who wrote about the different types of animals and how we relate to them. Now, I don't need to go into Al-Jahiz, but what this will show you is that a lot of the doctors in the Islamic age came from all around the world, as far as China, India, Ethiopia, Persia, and Europe. These doctors who came together and gave birth to a new type of medicine, an experimental type of medicine, one that really hadn't changed since the ancient times, with people like, the early Greek people copying from other Middle Easterners, copying from Egypt, and writing down several things that they saw and decided to go with, like the humors. But this was not all that happened. In fact, there were people who questioned that idea of the humors and its effectiveness. So much so that some of them believed that it was all just down to God, and that if you were sick, it was God's wrath, and if you were healed, that was God's mercy. Others thought that to be ridiculous, and that no God would ever make sure that you do not get a medicine. In fact, there's a quote in the Quran that says, "For every disease that God puts in the world, he puts in a cure." Like today, doctor wasn't just a general practice, even though there was a general practitioner. In other senses, there were doctors that were for specific parts of the human body. We know of doctors that focused solely on the eyes, other doctors that focus solely on the legs, solely on internal medicine, and all kinds of things that could be ranging. And in fact, there were some doctors that believed that, you should probably give someone something to make them throw up, and then through that, You could judge based on what came out, what the person was suffering from. Now, the philosophical take of medicine was passed on from the Greeks. In fact, you see here an ancient Greek talking to a Muslim, and the Muslim man being painted as extremely dark skinned. And this person is having a good conversation with one of the ancient Greek philosophers. This image is depicted by Jabr ibn Buktishu, who was a Nestorian, so he himself was not a Muslim, even though he operated under Muslim circumstances or Arab circumstances, which talks to the greaterness of the Islamic world, where at the time they believed in not isolating religions and just picking one religion and going, Islam will be the religion that works for us, therefore that's all. People actually came from several parts of the world, like Christianity. There were Christians in the Islamic world, there were Hindu people in the Islamic world, there were all types. Now, the person who is being depicted here, the dark person and the light person that is being depicted here, one of these is Aristotle, and I'll let you guess which one. Aristotle is being depicted here because one of the things that Jabril did was he took a bunch of information from the Greeks. So he sees himself as a direct transfer of the information from the ancient Greeks. Not only did he do this, but he also took the philosophical ideas from Aristotle about animals and how animals should be used in aiding with their body parts in the help of medicines when it came to human beings and even the animals themselves. He was a physician, and he pretty much did a lot of things in that sense. I mean, you can see here he commissioned an image. Now, I don't want to leave out Al-Jahiz because, of course, Al-Jahiz wrote the Book of Animals, in which he laid out the first steps, early steps of evolution. Before I go into what he did with animals and what he did with evolution and what he did with anything else, let's first read a quote from him. In this quote, he talks about the importance of many other crafts, including medicine. And you will notice in another section that he writes that music is just as interesting as medicine as a study. He says this: if a scholar stands up in the main street or the marketplace and discusses grammar and prosody, or discourses on the law, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, geometry, or the crafts, only specialists will gather round and dispute with him. But let him say so much as a word about predestination, or mention the knowledge and will of God, or capacity and responsibility, or consider whether or not God created unbelief, and there will be no fool or porter, no down and out wretch, no tongue tied idiot, or ignorant blockhead, who will not stop and argue and contribute his approval or criticism. These sort of people ought not to associate with the aristocracy. And furthermore, however good their intentions may be, they lack the attainments needed for understanding and discrimination. Nevertheless, there are categories and degrees among the people in the matter of knowledge of God. In this connection, the author refers, yeah. So I want everybody to pay attention to what he's saying there and see if it's not true in your life. In that, for several different subjects, people have to go to school for years and years. And for those, you can mention them in the streets and not a word will be said. Not an eye will be raised, and not a person will contribute in discussing or disagreeing. These are astronomy, mathematics, medicine, geometry, and craft. But talk about disbelief and belief, in other words, atheism and religion, or general philosophy, and everybody, which there it's translated as, um, let's just read it one more time, or mention the knowledge and will of God, or the capacity and responsibility, or consider whether or not God created unbelief, and there will be no fool of a porter, no down and out wretch, no tongue tied idiot, or ignorant blockhead who will not stop and argue and contribute his approval or criticism. And I think that's a very true statement even today, that people who couldn't be bothered to learn anything have a lot of opinions on stuff they probably have no business talking about. Now, of course, like I said, this is part of the philosophy of medicine as well. So it's good that he mentions their unbelief, because some people believe that everyone in the Islamic world was not allowed to talk about disbelief and stuff like that. And that's not true. There were atheists, people who used to be Muslim and were atheists in that region. And this is what I'm talking about when I say some people believed in demons in medicine, but there were people who were non believers who believed that God and everything related to medicine or related to the world had nothing to do with religion or any magical spirit of any kind. And they were so adamant in making sure that everybody understands that everything is based on reality here. Now, those atheists wouldn't be the same type that we have today, because, of course, these guys also believed that astronomy and planets and stuff like that could, those were the things that you should pay attention to. It wasn't pure rationalism like it is today. Now, his other contributions to medicine was also justifying things like alcohol, and also mentioning things like what the perfect woman would look like. Now, you might think that this has nothing to do with medicine, but at the time, nobody had really formed big opinions about these things, and Al Jahiz was not one to hold his tongue. And he says, I shall tell you of the nobility of nabidh and its superiority to others. Then I shall similarly demonstrate the superiority of your nabidh to all others. When nabidh soaks into your bones, spreads to every organ, and suffices into your brain, it clarifies your mind, redeems your spirit, relaxes you in the body and soul, and makes you carefree, gay, tolerant, optimistic, and good humored. It closes the door to suspicion and makes you understand everything and see everything in a favorable light. It liberates you from the bother of being on your guard, from carking anxiety, from fear of the future, from base covetousness, and from the tediousness of thinking about earning your living. In a word, from everything that hampers gladness, disturbs pleasure, weakens desire, or mars happiness. It gives old men the fire of youth and young men the exuberance of childhood. The only danger when drinking it is of going beyond the gay stage to the excitable or even the irritable stage. If its sole benefit were that as it seeps into your soul and mingles with your blood, it absolves you from trouble and effort, makes you appreciate jesting and wit, and abhor all earnestness, relieves you of the complications of bashfulness and the trammel of dignity, affords you a day of rest with an eye to days of thought that lie ahead, and facilitates your return to more serious things. That alone would be sufficient grounds for being grateful to it. and giving to a good character. Always good in your house, this drink is still better to serve. It is always noble, but in your case still nobler. If you suppose that I ask you for some in order to drink, serve, or sniff, or privately to pass it round in society, to make show of it among my equals, to test the heads of my cronies, to lavish it on my guests, or to put it within reach of my friends, you have a poor opinion of me indeed, and that ill judgment leads you to underrate it in many ways and do it great injustice. But if you suppose that I wish for some in order to gratify a woman, to win the friendship of a great man, to wash the impurities from my entrails, to pay the respect due to an alcoholic drink, to clear my bleary eyes and heal unwholesome bodies, or to be host to a fine poet, an eloquent orator, or a great man of letters, so that it may give them inspiration and ideas and lead them to express the gratitude they feel and the thanks they owe. If you suppose that I wish for some to draw a blessing from it, to soak myself in its benign influence, enjoy its presence, quench a thirst, or make from it the elixir of life, or to think of you when I look at it, then you have judged me aright. This is not his only defense of this beverage, which is thought to be a type of date wine, which he says is superior to other alcohols, but is still defensible to drink any kind of alcohol, as he mentions in a different chapter called The Drinker versus the Undrunk. He, of course, first addresses its legal status, talking about the lawfulness of nabidh, which again is a type of wine, alcoholic wine. Suppose we are asked, how do you know? It may be that nabidh falls within the prohibition on wine, but that since this originally applied only to wine proper, people suppose that that was all that was strictly unlawful, and that other liquors were only voluntarily included. We reply, we know that this is the opposite of our correspondent's view, for good and obvious reasons. First, the companions of the Prophet who witnessed the revelations of the precepts of the faith, and after them the descendants all agreed that a man who falsely accuses married women deserves to be punished, but they disagreed about alcoholic beverages, not because they did not know the names of the ingredients of wine, but because as regards the traditions quoted about the lawlessness or otherwise of these drinks, even if for Arabic speakers all ashriba were wine, they did not need to ask the transmitters of the tradition which drinks they applied to, any more than they needed to ask the difference between male and female slaves. To go into all the questions and answer implicit in the subject would be a lengthy business. Those who disagree with us about the lawfulness of nabid, recognizing that the names, ingredients, and origins of many intoxicants liquors are still known today, do not deny that God singled out wine for prohibition from among them all, leaving the others free like everything else that is lawful. The proof of this is that God has never forbidden men anything without allowing them a related category with roughly the same effect, in order that by the use of that which is lawful they may be enabled to do without the unlawful. I am speaking here of the traditional prohibitions, not common sense. For instance, he forbade spilt blood, but not blood which is not spilt, such as clotted blood in the liver spleen. The people of Medina all agree in regarding alcohol drinks as forbidden, but I reply, the preeminence of a town makes nothing lawful or unlawful. These things are known only from the eloquent book and the acknowledged sunnah, from authentic traditions and specific tests. Who, after all, is the immigrant or member of the Ansar on whose authority the unlawfulness of nabidh is reported? If he were a fair opponent, he would acknowledge that the people of Medina who prohibit nabidh are no more virtuous than those who condone certain abnormal sexual practices. Just as some Meccans regard the lending of wives as lawful, and others regard animals slaughtered by Negroes as unlawful because they say they are too ugly, while some Meccan judge pass sentence on the strength of a single witness or a single oath contrary to the letter of the revelation. The Meccans who inflict a scourging for a slight smell of wine impose the same penalty for carrying an empty skin because they reckon it a receptacle wine, so that an opponent of theirs once asked, why do they not scourge themselves, seeing that every man carries with him the instrument of fornication? On that argument, anyone who carries a sword, a dagger, or a strong poison should be convicted, for they are instruments of a crime against the men of Medina, have not devastated themselves of human nature, and put on the virtues of the angels. If all they say were right and true, they would have scourged all the people who went to listen to Mabad, Agrab, and other musicians and singers. Also, this is the longest defense of alcohol I've ever seen, and also it's actually one of the better ones, especially in Islam. As you know, a lot of Islamic countries ban alcohol, and you can see here that the debates about alcohol were far, far away. I love the part that he mentions Negroes and how some people didn't want to take uh, food that was uh, slaughtered by Negroes, which tells you, firstly, how many Negroes there were in the Islamic land, but not only that, it tells you the type of mentality that some of these Arabs had, that proves that they had racism in their time. Another standout is who's the father of Ada Lovelace? The father of Ada Lovelace, very popular person in the UK. Oh yeah, it's Lord Byron. Lord Byron once mentioned that he went to the Middle East and found homosexuality to be rampant. He was a homosexual himself, but it's very difficult to find evidence of this. But you can see here in this book where he mentions that in some parts, not Lord Byron, but the person Al Jahiz mentions that some parts of the Islamic states have allowed the unnatural, unnaturalness of these whatever. Now, obviously, he lived back in the day, so his opinion would be way different than what people have today, which is not fair for me to say, given the fact that they did allow it. I mean, but later he expresses a different opinion on the philosophy as well, and he says this time, if by prosperity, good health, and obscurity is meant a modest sufficiency, then the opinion expressed is a tenable one. But how is it possible to pass unobserved with great wealth. This being the big difference between his prior and his latter. This makes far more sense because, of course, if humbleness is a virtue, then how can having great wealth be a virtue? But I would agree with him in his earlier when he said, how can great health be the same? Although it is true that someone who's unhealthy, because most people are healthy, will stand out more than people who are healthy. Now, while it's true that the next part is not necessarily medicine or science that has to do with the physical body, the people or this person, Al Jahiz, regarded it that way, and that's why I will read it. He talks about the canon on feminine beauty, talking about what the perfect woman would look like. And he says, most people who know about women, most experts on the subject agree in preferring the majula, that is to say, the type of woman intermediate between fat and thin. Her figure must be elegant and shapely, her shoulders symmetrical, her back straight, her bones must be well covered, and she must be neither too plump nor too skinny. The word modula conveys the notion of tautness, of firm flesh without superfluous fat. A graceful walk is the most beautiful thing about a woman, and she cannot walk gracefully if she is portly, fat, and overabundant with flesh. Indeed, a modula is more often slim, and her slenderness is her best known feature. This is considered preferable both to the fat, corpulent woman and to the thin, skinny woman. A modula is described in prose by the words, the upper part of her body is a stem, the lower part a sundune. Now we all can know that there's no such thing as an expert, as today we know that beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, and that's just evident, and that's pretty much been evident throughout history. Leaving Al Jahiz, we visit another African tradition, the ancient Egyptians, because even though the Muslims had hooks and crooks and all these things that were built for surgery, they were not the first to invent them. On the walls of the Egyptians, what you see depicted are medical instruments, and they're followed by writing. A lot of these surgical instruments were used mainly by men, but in some cases, females. Interestingly, on this wall, we see there these scoops, we see sort of brushes, we see these scissors like plier things, we see some hooks with things. The way it's laid down, it's almost like how you would see them laid down on a surgical table. It's funny how no matter, by the way, yes, they are very quote unquote medieval. They're ancient, but they're very medieval in the way no doctor really uses anything like this today. That's how you get sick. And also remember, back in the day, like doctors would not just take anybody, because if something bad happened to you, that doctor could be put out completely himself.